Great. So I just want to say thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. We have folks from really all over the place. It's great. We have folks from the States, Jenna and Yokoyama Sensei Gyoke, abbot of Sozenji Temple in Montebello. And we also have with us Kyo, who is the abbot of Choshoin Temple in Japan. So we have great to see you again, Kyo. Thank you for joining us. And thank you everybody for joining us for Rocky Mountain Zen. So we start off usually with a quick our land acknowledgement. And so we acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples, presently subject to Treaties 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, Kainai Pikanitsitsika, Cree Dene, Soto, Nakota Sud, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta. This includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We acknowledge the many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. We're grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. Great. So we have our special guest tonight is Dr. John Harding, who's Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Lethbridge. And John was the editor and contributing author to a book called Buddhism in the Global Eye, Beyond East and West. And welcome, John. Thank you very much for taking the time. And you were at the annual meeting for Nika Yuko, I think, which is near and dear to Rocky Mountain Zen's heart. So, yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Aaron, for inviting me, and thank you, everyone. I do have the chat part open also in case like there's problems with my audio or questions come up. I mean, you can turn your mic on and just bring up a question anytime, but if you'd rather put something in the chat, I'll keep an eye on that. As Aaron mentioned, I am coming from the annual general meeting of Nikkei and coming a little later than I anticipated. So although I have slides, I should acknowledge in the beginning, I haven't carefully brought down the large number of slides to a small number for our discussion tonight. That's mostly just my fault for running late, but a little bit of it is also intentional because I'm trying to also find out what might be of greatest interest to this group. I had some email correspondence with Aaron, and he had brought up this recent book, and I mentioned that some of my earlier work talks about some of the earlier encounters between Japanese Buddhism and the West, especially the one that goes back to the early 2000s. This one called Mahayana Phoenix, and it looks at Japan's Buddhists at the 1893 World's Parliaments of Religion. So I thought I would start with some of that earlier material, but also bring up some different examples from works in between those two that look at the Jodo Shinshu community here in Alberta and how that community has navigated some of the changes and transformations over decades. And maybe touch on a couple of European examples as well, and then just sort of see where people's interests are and what you might want to discuss more closely out of those options or anything else. So you may see an alarming number of slides when I share the screen, but again, some I'll just be kind of moving through and having here in case you want to look more closely at any of those aspects when we're in conversation mode at the end. The other issue that might look just a little strange is I have had a bit of crashing on my system. So instead of going into Keynote, I'm just going to show one slide at a time. Can you see this slide reasonably well if I just show it in this way that's less likely to crash. Okay. So I'll just do that then. So these are different aspects of East-West encounters for global Buddhism in the modern era, and East and West are in those scare quotes because part of the purpose of that more recent book, Buddhism and the Global Eye Beyond East and West, is to kind of pull the rug out from under some of the assumptions of an essentialized idea of East and an essentialized idea of West. So I recognize that in using those terms, I'm working a little bit against what I'm arguing for in that book. So I'll just throw scare quotes on and that should take care of it. Okay. Some of this work is tied into a long-term collaborative research venture with a couple of research colleagues. Victor Solgan-Hori from McGill University, now retired, and Alex Soucy from St. Mary's University out in Halifax. Victor's also ordained in the Zen tradition, and with those two, I've done a lot of this work together. So I just want to acknowledge them from our little Global Buddha website there. And then a couple of the examples for Jodo Shinshu here in Alberta come from our first work together. So this Wild Geese Buddhism in Canada, we did in 2010, and then followed up in 2014 with this one called Flowers on the Rock, Global and Local Buddhisms in Canada. So it's going from Canada specific to more global, to the one Aaron mentioned in the beginning, that's looking at global patterns without focusing on Canada especially. So some of the same themes emerge throughout this trajectory of work, including the importance of understanding that a lot of the sort of modernization of Buddhism that's spread around the globe, most of the important aspects that have happened actually happened in Asia, and a lot of the key reformers and modernizers were Asian Buddhists. So sometimes when we talk about Buddhism in the West or Western Buddhism, too much focus ends up being placed on certain figures who didn't grow up in Buddhist families, who didn't come from Asian descent. And these books sort of point that out and try to kind of bring the balance back in the direction of greater agency of a lot of the Asian Buddhist modernizers. Okay, so these are some things from those books. This is part of the skipping over, unless we need some more specifics later on. And this is that most recent book that Aaron mentioned that came out right at the start of the pandemic, the Beyond East and West. Okay. So we see more academic attention to Buddhism in the West. We've seen actually for 2 or 3 decades now, a fair bit more attention. Jeff Wilson is a scholar here in Canada who does excellent work like that Mindful America that you see there. Raphael Léogier, a brilliant philosopher and sociologist in France, was working on global Buddhism from some time ago. And David McMahon is one of the main figures for looking at these issues of Buddhist modernism. But before this more recent attention to what's going on with Buddhism in the West, I want to look back at this early encounter. So I'm going to skip some of those text-heavy slides and just talk a little bit about how, in Europe and North America, very little was known about Buddhism with any real specific sense of being able to separate Buddhism out from, say, Hinduism. When we look at 1700s and a good bit of the 1800s, but there were some exceptions. There was some good scholarship coming out from people like Eugene Burnouf in France in the fairly early to mid 19th century, and they were piecing together these reports from missionaries and travelers and others who had been in South Asia and East Asia. And the different reports, it wasn't clear to many scholars and travelers and others in the West that these reports were talking about the same tradition. As far as they could tell, because of the different languages and different customs and the rest of it, it was a variety of traditions. But Eugene Burnouf, realized that, okay, they're actually talking about the same tradition. This is Buddhism, and we start to get some better scholarship of that. But it's not just scholarly accounts, and maybe even more particularly, it's more popular accounts that I think move Buddhism more into the mainstream in places like North America and Europe. So we get works at the end of the 19th century, like Edwin Arnold's The Light of Asia, a biography of the historical Buddha in a kind of romanticized Victorian sort of prose. And it was, it was a favorite of Queen Victoria. That's what got him knighted. And, this sort of was quite popular. But we also have figures like that picture in the bottom of the Theosophers, Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott, who are part of this sort of movement that becomes a little bit suspicious of some of the claims of Christianity and Christian missionaries, and becomes quite enamored with both Hinduism and Buddhism, and then moving more into to Buddhism with figures like Olcott, traveling to India and Sri Lanka and kind of fighting against some of the colonial oppression, not only of those cultures, but colonial oppression of Buddhism as well. So we get things like the flag, the sort of Buddhist flag from Olcott. All right, so this is the chapter. This is the part that I think gets really quite interesting for this early encounter. And I think some of the things that happen at places like the World's Parliament of Religions in 1893 set the tone for the way that Buddhism is introduced to an audience in the West, and some of the expectations that are established around Buddhism kind of fit with this presentation. So two of the figures here, Shakuson and Anagarika Dharmapala, are two of the Buddhist representatives at this World's Fair. And I do want to show a few pictures of that, because it's hard for us to fully understand what a big deal this World's Parliament of Religions was as part of the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. Those World Fairs going back to London in the middle of the 1800s were such a big deal on the world stage. And with different successive ones, different aspects of sort of comparing cultures came up. So Paris held one with a strong emphasis on art, for example. Sometimes you'd have Western colonial powers sort of showing off their colonial holdings, but the one in Chicago was the first one to bring religious traditions in and have this kind of comparative sense of religions from around the world. And two of the figures in this slide were part of how Buddhism was presented. The other one, Shakukozen, spent time in South Asia, as did Shakusoen. So these Japanese figures were also in more direct dialogue with Buddhists from Theravadan traditions of South Asia. So they were kind of exploring their own Buddhism relative to other types of Buddhism that were quite different from their own traditions, and then presenting again on this world stage. So Anagarika Dharmapala represents sort of a more southern Buddhism. Shakusoen was one of the 5 main representatives for Japanese Buddhism at that forum, and he was representing Zen, in his case from the Rinzai Zen tradition. This is a bit of what that stage looked like, and you had a little over 30 million people going to that Columbian Exposition, and those who didn't attend from places like North America and Europe were reading about it in newspapers and hearing different accounts of it. And the organizers made a big point of inviting these delegates from Asia and putting them at center stage for pictures like this at the opening of the parliament and the closing of the parliament, for it to serve its purpose of introducing sort of religion worldwide. They really needed to have this kind of representation from abroad, and they really promoted it. And the American organizers were especially promoting having Japan there. The US organizers saw themselves as a sort of reflection of some of the dynamics of Japan in the late 1800s, just as the US was trying to establish itself as separate from Europe and not inferior to Europe. They saw that with the dynamics of Japan and China at the time, of separate from the Asian mainland and not in the shadow of China. So they would call Japan sort of the Yankees of the East, and they saw themselves in the Japanese representatives and really wanted the Japanese representatives there. So, might not need some of this part from sort of Meiji history in Japan, but Buddhism had undergone a brief persecution with the reopening of Japan and institution of Shinto. And so Buddhism in Japan, at the very time that they were putting together some of their presentations for the West, they were also responding to some domestic challenges in Japan. And with the rapid modernization in the Meiji period, felt a need to prove that Buddhism wasn't an old, traditional kind of drag on the modernizing project, but was in fact a really culturally vibrant and important part for Japan moving forward. So some of what they were presenting to the West was also being done strategically to re-present back in Japan, sort of showing the success of the tradition and its importance at this pivotal moment of rapid modernization in Japan. Let's skip over Kiezawa Manshi for the moment. Some of these just sort of talk about some of the back and forth that was going on with understandings of Christianity and Buddhism in Japan, because some Japanese modernizers, seeing the modernity of the West, wondered out loud, is it necessary to be Christian to bring on some of this sort of modernization? And then others were responding that no, that wasn't the case. And in fact, a lot of the scientific advances in the West were calling Christianity into question. So Buddhism was actually, they would argue, well positioned to continue as key tradition for Japan and an important sort of modern influence. Okay. So again, these are just things that could go back to. Some of them are sort of interesting anecdotes as these friends would sort of plan out their own careers as, you know, philosopher in Buddhist tradition and as zoologist to bring in some of the evolutionary theory as a way to crush Christianity, but then showing great disappointment later on that it didn't really crush Christianity. All right, back to some of the images. So this when we think about some of the exchange between East and West through Buddhism as such a global tradition even today, this setting, again, I would argue was a big part of it. A lot of people were involved. The even layout of where countries were represented at the exposition grounds in Chicago ended up being quite important too. And Japan understood this and took advantage of this more fully than a lot of countries. So the image here is called the Midway Plaisance, and you would have, this was the first Ferris wheel ever in history, and you would have different countries' representations. But this was a period of time where a lot of anthropologists were understanding the world and culture as its own kind of evolutionary spectrum from less advanced to more advanced. And naturally, they always put themselves as the most advanced, in this case, like Western, white, Protestant, America, sort of Europe. And the area called the White City had a lot of the buildings that were kind of representing this idea of what they saw as a culmination of culture. But right in the middle of the White City, we'll see in just a moment, is Japan's representation here. So again, just the sheer numbers, 700,000 in attendance that day shortly after the parliament. There's a little larger image of that White City, that Midway Plaisance. And some of the descriptions, some very racist descriptions talking about different cultures, quite harsh toward China throughout, but generally very positive about Japan, even though some of the positive descriptions, when you get hold of these books from the early 1890s and read newspaper accounts, are still, you know, insulting in their own way, but they saw themselves as being extremely positive toward Japan. Okay, so here's that presence right in the midst of the White City. So this is the little island out there, and the Hoden Pavilion, the Phoenix Pavilion. So this was based architecturally a bit on Byodo-in in Japan, in Uji, not far southeast of Kyoto. And these beautiful structures ended up, you know, influencing Frank Lloyd Wright, who visited there. And there's all sorts of cultural influence into North America from Japan. But you also had people writing newspaper accounts of how the structures were built by the Japanese carpenters and artisans, and everyone was quite impressed. The Japanese minister in Washington, D.C. at the time understood the importance of their presence here. So this is a quote from him showing that, one of the strategic objectives of pouring a lot of money into this display and securing that prime real estate was to show that Japan is a country worthy of full fellowship in the family of nations. Japan at this time was still laboring under unfair trade laws, for example. Okay, so there are a lot of accounts, and again, some of them that they would see as very favorable would still be seen rightly as insulting in our own time. They're also looking at some of Japan's art displays. And I want to skip on to the Buddhist representatives themselves. This is about all that remains of that Columbian Exposition, this building now, and then a small Japanese garden on that wooded aisle. All right, so back to the Parliament, back to some of these figures, back to this key event for Buddhism in the West. All right, those are some of the organizers. Here are some of the key figures for Buddhism and for Hinduism. Apparently Vivekananda, who introduced Hinduism in a lot of the ways it's still best understood in the West, apparently looked like a stage actor of the day and had many fans. Dharmapala, both of these figures had very fluent English because of the British colonial presence, but those fluent English language skills and their rhetorical flourish and ability helped them out quite a bit in their presentations. And along with the Japanese Buddhists, there was also a representative for Shinto, Shibata Ryuichi. And this newspaper article would be too small to read. Part of it's talking about Anagarika Dharmapala, who is representing South Asian Buddhism, but part is about Shibata. And it's a reminder that this was a key introduction for many people unfamiliar with these traditions to start to become familiar, but it doesn't mean that the understanding was necessarily very deep. Some of it was quite superficial. Some of it was kind of pageantry and costumes. So in the case of Shibata, he didn't read his address about Shinto. One of the organizers read it, but he stood there dressed like you see in the picture here. And at the end of it, there was a standing ovation and some women rushed the stage and he apparently kissed two of them. And in the newspaper article, they just said, oh, that's just a Japanese custom, nothing to worry about. Well, public displays of affection are not all that common in Japan. So again, there are misunderstandings, but you can kind of see from the description of the article, just the excitement around the introduction of these traditions. And then this is the Buddhist contingent from Japan, representing Shingon, Renzaizen, Tendai, Jodo Shinshu. In particular, a layperson not pictured with the group down here was quite influential as well, in part because of his English language skills. So just to say a little bit more about this, and then move on to some other areas. There is the question of why did they come? Playing off of the koan of why did Bodhidharma come from the West? Why did the Buddhists come to the West? Many in Japan were warning them against it. They saw it as a bit of a trap, that would be a kind of unfair playing field set up by these Protestant organizers, and they wouldn't be given a fair chance, and they shouldn't go. But this group and some of their backers thought it was important, that they had something really important that they could offer to the West. It could help Japan's standing, but also they, were looking around at the world and seeing some of the focus on things like material prosperity. And they really thought that, Buddhist values could be quite helpful. And as I indicated before, there was also the agenda that if they're successful in the West, they can promote that success back in Japan, where Buddhism had recently had that short period of persecution. So there's a variety of motives. And when you read the journals from some of these figures, some of those motives and ideas come through a little bit more strongly. Okay. So we have Shingon and Tendai here. You get a little bit of the language of seeing this as a chance to be kind of conquering heroes, but in a religious and cultural way. want to move to the Zen figure in a moment. Oh, this is another part that I think is a little bit important for some of this encounter. When we, early on, I did bring up some of the early scholarship. We have people like Eugene Burnouf from France. A lot of the scholars later in the 1800s are coming out of places like the United Kingdom, and they're bringing in some of their own bias from their largely Protestant tradition. So they're doing things like talking about the earlier Buddhism being more pure, Mahayana going to East Asia being, having too many cultural embellishments that aren't not as pure as early Buddhism. And Tibetan Buddhism, they don't even call Tibetan Buddhism, they call Lamaism, because there's so much focus on the Lama. But when you read the writings of these scholars, you can see there's more than scholarship going on. Their own Protestant anti-Catholic biases are coming through in how they're describing things like Tibetan Buddhism. So the Japanese Buddhists were aware of this. Some Japanese Buddhists from a couple of different traditions had studied in the West under figures like Max Mueller, and they realized that they needed to help educate the West and promote the Mahayana, the greater vehicle tradition. So you would get quotes like this that would talk about the Mahayana as being the culmination, the highest point, the most important part of the tradition. So there again, there's quite a bit more here, much too much for now. But this is the other part that I want to introduce, to sort of set the stage for some of the ways that people in the West have engaged with Buddhism. There was a intentional and strategic positioning of Buddhism at this time in this place as more scientific than, say, Christianity. And I think we see a lot of that still. And there's very good reasons within the Buddhist tradition of not being so reliant on some aspects of miracles and faith and this and that, but still the presentation of Buddhism took out parts that might not look favorable and promoted parts that really emphasized a sort of humanistic and scientific tradition. And Shakusoin from the Zen tradition was a fairly significant part of this positioning. So here's Shakusoin. He's someone who had gone to one of the modern universities with some Western influence in Japan, to Waseda. He had gone to Sri Lanka to learn some things about the Theravadan tradition of that country. And he's someone that, from early on was promoted within his own tradition and held high status at the time that he went over to Chicago. So he was seen as an especially influential figure. So this goes into more detail than we need about what he was presenting. But when he's talking about the law of cause and effect, he absolutely is talking about Buddhist teachings, but he's also talking about them in a way that fits well with this idea of promoting Buddhism as scientific. So this is where I think some of it gets a little more interesting, at least for an academic digging around in archives. So when I was looking at the letters that Shakusoin and D.T. Suzuki and Paul Harris and others were circulating, I think all three dogs invaded, and one of them's able to open doors. So it's talented, but not necessarily helpful. When you look at their letters, this gets to, okay, so even though this is from that earlier work, hoping I understood the conversation with Aaron correctly, that some of this early encounter might be of interest, this is an example from that early encounter that also fits what I'm trying to get at with the more recent one about how talking about these ideas of East and West are sometimes a little deceptive. Because you have Paul Karras is a Western publisher, originally from Germany, originally a theology student of Christianity, but he comes to the US and he becomes a little bit disenchanted with Christianity, and he talks instead about a religion of science, and he likes what he's hearing about Buddhism, and he becomes a little bit interested in Taoism as well. And D.T. Suzuki, the famous popularizer of Zen and Japanese culture in North America and Europe, comes to live with them and help do some translations. And at this time, D.T. Suzuki had been a lay student of Shakusoen back in Kamakura, Japan. And so Shakusoen, through D.T. Suzuki, is influencing how Paul Carus understands Buddhism. But Paul Carus's own ideas of the religion of science are also shaping how he understands Buddhism and how he then writes about Buddhism, because he writes books about Buddhism. And following the World's Parliament of Religion, he's a bit concerned that there's a sort of letter to the editor from one of the organizers that isn't being quite fair to the Buddhist presentations. So he's writing to Shakusoen and saying, you need to reply to that critic, and here's what you should say about Buddhism. And when you read the letters in the archives, you find that Shakusoen writes back, and again, he kind of talks about his own position as a modernizer, but he basically says, yes, print that letter. So really that letter that Carus wrote, but print it as Shakusoen's reply. So it's supposedly the authoritative Eastern voice against the Western critic, but it's written by a Western sympathizer of Buddhism, Paul Carus, who in turn is influenced by D.T. Suzuki and Shakusoen in how he understands Buddhism. So it's just complicated layers of, what's East and what's West and what's influencing what. And it gets even more complicated because then later, when some of the first Jodo Shinshu missionaries come over to the San Francisco Bay Area, they contact Paul Carus right away, let him know what they're doing to bring Buddhism to North America, and talk about how influential his book on Buddhism was to them, though it seems in part that was also because his book they were using the English translation and it was useful for them from a language standpoint. But you have this kind of complicated relationship of global cross currents that are influencing each other in multiple repeated kind of ways. Okay. So I should probably move out of that. This is one of those books of Paul Carus that became influential, and get to something else to then see if this is something that people want to discuss or move in a different direction. Those are some of the same figures, including D.T. Suzuki. This is from a seminar talking about some of the growth of Buddhism in the West, some of the different directions of these early figures, early teachers coming from different parts of Asia to the West, training students there, also Western students going and studying in Zen monasteries and other settings, and some of the back and forth, as well as some of the just sort of pop culture ways that Buddhism has spread. And then on the very bottom of this one, an idea that some of the description I was giving for that 1893 World Parliament of Religion is still with us. Some of the ties to science and rationality, to sort of psychology and mindfulness and humanistic focus that are part of Buddhism are even a greater part of Buddhism for many in the West than they might be in some other parts of the world because of the way it was presented and represented to that audience early on. So one other part that came up in the correspondence with Aaron, I mentioned that some of the work had to do with Jodo Shinshu here in Alberta, some of the dynamics of figuring out, how to move forward with a tradition from Japan, but now in Canada into a third and fourth generation. So we have our early Buddhist minister in Canada, much like the case if you look at like Hosen Isobe for the Soto tradition, who was in Hawaii first and then in North America. We had a lot of that with Jodo Shinshu as well, sometimes Hawaii first, sometimes directly to North America, and similar kind of dates just a little bit earlier for some of the Jodo Shinshu figures in places like Canada. I'm in Lethbridge, and Lethbridge is the city, as many of you know, a small city of just 100,000 people. Just 20 minutes or so away is a very small town called Raymond, and that had the first Buddhist temple in Canada east of the Rocky Mountains. So this is a picture here from this started in 1929 in Raymond, the Raymond Buddhist Church. It was in a church that had been a meeting house for the Latter-day Saints, for the Mormon community. And the Mormon community and the Japanese community were actually quite supportive of each other for much of Raymond's history. And they sold them this building, so it looked like a church. Japan called it, the minister in the community called it a church rather than temple or otera or something like that, because the multicultural, pluralistic Canada that we know and talk about was not the Canada of 1929, right? So the really racist immigration laws, especially at times like the 1920s, only really changed significantly in the latter half of the 1960s. Only from the beginning of the 1970s do we have some of the multicultural policies. So now you have a Buddhist temple of Southern Alberta, but back then you had the Buddhist church. And Yutetsu Kawamura was the second minister there, and his son Les Kawamura was a very good friend of mine and a great scholar of Buddhism who passed away some years ago. But it's just a boy in that picture. Here he is. There's Les Kawamura in more recent times. So for how the dynamics were navigated, there's of course a lot to that history. But one thing, when I was speaking with some different Buddhist temples from Jodo Shinshu in Hawaii about what was going on in Alberta, this is what they found interesting. You had small temples in rural settings where a lot of the population had moved away, or second or third generation. Maybe they were still involved with Buddhism, but they had moved to Calgary, they'd moved to larger cities. So you didn't have enough population base to support the small temples in the rural settings. So this groundbreaking in 2007 is the new Buddhist temple of Southern Alberta, where those smaller ones were closed down, sold off, and amalgamated into this one new structure. And the people with whom I was talking about this for Jodo Shinshu in Hawaii were kind of amazed at this because they were facing some of the same dynamics. They had mini temples, some of them very small, especially in more rural settings. But even if they had only 2 or 3 people there, they couldn't imagine those people ever letting the doors close and amalgamating to a new temple like this. So they were excited, interested, also not sure if that would really work in the same way in their kyodon in Hawaii. So this is the case for Lethbridge, and there were some tensions and there were some difficulties. It wasn't always easy, but now instead of 5 small ones, there's this one larger one. You do have a larger sense of congregation and a little more range of ages, though I think it still skews a little bit more to older than younger. And this is how they've been proceeding in Lethbridge for Jodo Shinshu, which has been the oldest tradition in Canada. And for the first half of the history of Buddhism in Canada, I would argue Jodo Shinshu has been the dominant form of Buddhism, where in the second half, Zen and Tibetan and all kinds of other forms have been quite influential. So this is part of that same ceremony. Some other images of what Buddhism has looked like in Canada. And certainly in coastal BC, there are some areas that have some very strong influences from a variety of Asian countries and a variety of Buddhist temples in the style of their home country. This one in Lethbridge is a little bit more, you can kind of see the picture there, compared to just the Protestant looking church before. It has, some Japanese elements, but also some Southern Alberta prairie elements. It's a little bit of a mix. Okay. The image on the bottom left are different scholars in Canada at a gathering that Leslie Kawamura organized for the study of Buddhism in Canada. We have the Dalai Lama visiting Canada. We've got some different figures that are part of Buddhism in Canada. And then I just had 2 slides to bring up from some work that I was doing with Buddhism in Europe that touches a little bit more in a Soto direction. But this is an area that I don't know as much about. So 12 years ago, plus a week, so May 10th of 2010, I just pulled up earlier today a interview that I had with Vanya Palmers, and he had been a student of Shunryu Suzuki's student, Koban, from San Francisco Zen Center. And this interview was in Lucerne, Switzerland. He's a Swiss citizen, and a lot of his work on animal rights, but also Zen Buddhism. He was also someone involved in psychedelics and things, who's been primarily in Switzerland. So I was talking to him about some of the dynamics of the San Francisco Zen Center. So, this is jumping, more to 60s and 70s and 80s and some of those transitions. And just a reminder again that as I would look around the European scene, you would see strong representation of Zen Buddhism. But by the time I was doing these interviews from about 2010, I would say you were starting to see even stronger representation of Tibetan Buddhism. So there was sort of waves of interest of different kinds of Buddhism in the West. And as my colleague in France, Raphael Liogier, points out, people also had sort of preferences that he thought fit aesthetic sensibilities, like cool and rational Zen versus more kind of engaged, ritual, colorful warmth of Tibetan. He was sort of seeing it as personality types being pulled to different types of Buddhism, or sometimes to Sufi Islam, or to Taoism, or to something. And so I started playing around with ideas. This slide isn't very well developed, but I was doing interviews in the countries you see here in the darker font, because I wanted to see places that were notably secular, like the UK, Czech Republic, France with its laïcité becoming more and more secular, places that were notably Catholic in a lot of the religious origins, Poland, France, Spain, places that had been part of the former Eastern Bloc, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland. And you'll see in the Venn diagram, Poland is Eastern Bloc, but Catholic, Czech Republic, notably secular, but coming from Eastern Bloc, France, Catholic, but moving in the secular direction, to see if some dynamics would come through in terms of the Buddhism practiced and talked about in some of those places. The idea that there might be more of a kind of Catholic grammar underneath some of the religious expression in some of the more predominantly Catholic countries, which might also be connecting in some ways with some of the surging interest in the Tibetan tradition that I was seeing at the time I was doing this work. Again, that work hasn't been completed, isn't fully thought out. It's just kind of some initial thoughts to talk about this larger idea of encounter and to see what interests any of you. So maybe I should stop that part there, and I can go into anything that came up already in a little more detail, or move in other directions, or just talk, because you may have heard enough from me by this point.
Great. Thank you, John. Yeah, so the floor is open.
I'm going to jump in because I absolutely, my academic work that I did undergraduate and then post-undergraduate was in religious studies, and more so on the Christianity side in Asia, but it's kind of nice when I started practicing Zen to kind of see the other side. But actually one of the questions I had was, you kind of alluded to it, but I'm actually more curious about it. So I've heard a lot of Buddhist practitioners talk about mindfulness on the as a form of mental health exercise, but I've also heard a lot of them be somewhat critical of the sense that they're basically taking a portion of the quote unquote doctrine out of the actual formula. And I was curious to know from your side and the academic side, if you think that that's a valid argument, or if that's something that it's just, take mindfulness out, do that thing, but ignore the rest of the Eightfold Path kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's a good question and an important issue. As you know from your own academic work in the religious studies world, a lot of scholars of religious studies are often hesitant or careful, or try to avoid making normative statements of, the way Vipassana should be done or understood, or the way this meditation, should be this way, And this changed version that you see is, a bastardization or a westernization that, has taken out the real religious core of it. So we usually kind of avoid talking in terms of setting the boundaries of what something is supposed to be, though that's not always the case, and not for everyone. But I come from kind of a historical approach where I like to kind of see what's happening, sort of see the dynamics, try to understand the larger context, but not necessarily weigh in and say, it should be this way or it should be that way. But it's an important distinction. And a lot of conversations around Buddhism in the West will also talk about issues of authority and authenticity. Is this the real thing? And the way that some of these types of meditation have been kind of separated from the tradition. They run a wide spectrum from very intentional versions of this, especially with mindfulness, and sometimes intentional because, in the United States, for example, with separation of church and state, there are, school systems that think doing mindfulness techniques with kindergarten students is super effective to get them to kind of settle down and focus and have this enjoyable educational experience. But they also know that if they talk about it as, sort of Buddhist training or something, then there will be a backlash from parents or from the state. So some are being very intentional about sort of stripping away specific religious origins of some practices and just say, yeah, it's good mental health and good physical health. You'll sometimes see this for PTSD, for people coming back from conflict, and in a lot of different settings. At the same time, when you look at a book like Jeff Wilson's Mindful America, he'll say, it is a little odd that you'll see, like mindful eating, mindful sex, mindful parenting, when like coming from a Buddhist monastic tradition, eating isn't the kind of mindful eating they're talking about. Sex shouldn't be the mindful sex that they're talking about. And parenting, might be happening, but isn't really a major focus in the monastic community. So yeah, that it has been applied to so many different things is certainly a departure. But when I talk about it, or when Jeff Wilson talks about it, we do also talk about some of the Asian reformers, especially in Southeast Asia, for some of the mindful techniques that did a lot of that transformation even before they brought it to the West, and were already kind of promoting it in a more secular way when it got to the West. So it isn't just, Westerners or a fast food culture or something taking those parts out. It was also kind of intentional and strategic for mindfulness techniques as well. I see a hand up from Colin.
Yeah, riffing off of that was very informative. I was curious, though, if it would be possible to speak to that difference in culture. As you say, the Japanese and some of the Southeast Asian Buddhist communities are adapting before it gets here. But how does a monastic tradition land and adapt to a fundamentally lay culture where there's not really the same infrastructure to allow for a more traditional idea of Zen in the West? How do you find that feeds back and forth across those East and West spaces?
Yeah, I think that is a real challenge for sure. And I think, there are probably people here, if they want to chime in, that could maybe speak to it more directly and authoritatively. But you're right. If you're a monk in Thailand, you can more easily follow some of the ideas in terms of, rarely handling money and other things, because your public transportation is going to be free. It's a respected choice. It's a supported choice. And there's a lot of things that are made easier and more possible for you than if you are in a place like Canada that hasn't had a monastic tradition in quite the same way. And it isn't always obvious where the challenges are, but one of the challenges I find really interesting, I reviewed an article a few years ago for the Journal of Global Buddhism that was talking about the merit economy, and how in a country, you know, again, I'll use Thailand here, in an economy that has the sense of producing and sharing merit, and where the monastic is a field of merit. So, you know, a monastic on alms rounds, that's not in this sense so much for the lay people to support the monastic as it is for the monastic to provide the opportunity of merit to the lay people. And so there's all kinds of support coming to the temple or the monastery and to the monastics. And it can be understood as a type of exchange in this merit economy where the lay people are getting a lot of things out of it too. Now, if you go into a North American setting that doesn't have that same sense of a merit economy and doesn't have the same support for monastics, yeah, there can be real challenges. You know, how will the monastics be supported by a lay community that isn't incentivized in quite the same way to support them? You might have people interested in coming for a weekend retreat and maybe even interested in kind of donating, but maybe not quite as committed to donating and seeing it as part of their own production and redistribution of merit. So there are challenges for sure. And, you know, I briefly brought up, you know, Vanya Palmer and San Francisco Zen Center. There were some difficult dynamics for the San Francisco Zen Center, also coming around the having, you know, Western students not accustomed to monastic teacher, and monastics, you know, from Japan, not accustomed to the lay Western students, and sort of negotiating those cultural differences weren't always easy, and you know, probably still aren't fully easy. So these become some of the questions around how to adapt and how to survive and how to thrive. But like I said, I would guess there are people on this call that have a better sense of maybe some of the dynamics now and some of those adaptations much better than I do. If anyone wants to chime in.
Just want to say thank you very much, John, for all the insight. It's been wonderful to hear your observation. I appreciate it. Well, I work as a missionary for Soto Zen, particularly now in California, and I work for the umbrella organization. So I found this quite the title for today's talk was quite intriguing in a sense. As for missionaries, we always say United States is like an ocean. You have a lot of resources, and you can kind of stick to your own bunch, like group of folks. Zen, we have enough network, I feel like. But I always kind of feel like Canada is a little bit different. They always says Canada is very quiet, like lake, like a pond, but the resource is limited. Do you think it's true? But before, I guess that you sort of mentioned this dynamic. I think Yugen and I are going through this interesting expectation gap, which I think is meant to be, and that's the realm of unknown. Like, so I try to not set the expectation like this is what you have to do because this is a whole different country. So anyway, sorry. So that was a response to what you're saying. But I appreciate if you could sort of share your view on this related to what Colin was saying, the gap of infrastructure and resources, and how, you know, we can sort of navigate ourselves, especially in a country like Canada.
Yeah, here too, I'm guessing that you probably already have better answers or a better better sense of that dynamic than I do, but I'll give it a try. I am a dual citizen, and my training was in the U.S. So I've been a Canadian citizen. I've been here in Canada for almost 20 years, but I did my undergraduate in the Pacific Northwest, south of Seattle, and my PhD at Penn and Princeton, the Ivies of the East Coast. And so I have a sense of some of those U.S. dynamics. And yeah, I mean, there are differences. I mean, the U.S. and Canada are different, and in a lot of ways, you know, I think of Canada as somewhere in a spectrum between sort of some Western European norms and some U.S. norms, sometimes being closer to Europe, sometimes being closer to the U.S. And my presence in Canada may also give you a bit of an indication of which I prefer on the whole. But one of those differences you'll see with so take universities. Universities in the US have, many of them have really large endowments and large donations and large support around sporting programs. Well, sporting programs are also kind of a type of civic religion and belongingness. And Canada, you will have people donating to Canadian universities, but Canada also has, you know, a strong social safety net. And I think for the most part, people may not feel quite as strongly that if I don't financially support this, it will wither and die. They're like, you know, it's probably supported, but I really like it, so I'm going to support it a bit extra. So in the US, there is a failing at a level of, you know, healthcare and some of that social safety net, but a counter to that larger sort of social safety net failing is that people do really support the things they support, and you can see it in the endowments. You can see it in, again, with the ocean and lake kind of metaphor, the wealth, the enthusiasm behind some of those teams and those schools and the things that they're supporting. So I don't get a strong sense that, you know, like the US has a monastic tradition much more strongly than Canada, so they understand monastics and support them. If that's the case, I've missed that completely. I haven't really seen that dynamic. But I think there might be something a bit different around some of the ways that support and affiliation is shown, and some of the ways it's kind of monetized, I think is a bit different in the US. But this is out of my area. This is not something that I know much about. And I'd be fascinated to hear more of, you know, your own experience and what you found between the two places, because I think you would have a better sense of this than I would.
Thank you. Well, I don't. So I'm still trying to figure it out. Um, just if you don't mind, just one more question. I would appreciate your perspective from an umbrella organization's lens. We see United States as its own being almost, but from Tokyo side, we look at the global Soto Zen Buddhism. I'm sorry, I'm just talking about Soto Zen here. So when I look at the relationship with the European region, South American region, it's just kind of an intuitive sense that, you know, somehow Canada seems like more, a little bit more, I don't know, like a little bit more aware, or is this like a little more of my sort of romanticization of Canadians? Or I'm just that's where I've been always kind of curious about, particularly in Canada, how that.
Yeah, and again, you know, kind of anecdotally, but I even though Canada's embrace of the sort of multiculturalism and pluralism is, you know, really more 50, 55 years old rather than going all the way back. Well, 50 or 55 years is still a pretty long time. And I think that embrace is pretty genuine for a lot of people. And I think in some ways, I feel like Canada's diversity is a bit more diverse than the US's diversity. If you look at like a city like Toronto, you know, people from so many countries and languages, ethnicities and foods. So if you did a pie chart, you would have a lot of small slivers from all over. And in the US, you might have some larger slivers of, African American, Hispanic. It's diverse, but the diversity might not be quite as diverse. And in the US, you'll have people who are incredibly cosmopolitan and have traveled the world and know various languages. But if you're describing the US as a whole, you wouldn't necessarily say, that characterizes the US more than Canada or more than Europe. Europe would be very much the norm to know a few languages. Canada, again, I think is kind of in between. A lot of people will know 2 or 3. Some will only know English, but that I generally feel there's quite a bit of openness in Canada. I generally feel that embrace of the kind of pluralism and multiculturalism, even though it's not quite as old as some Canadians might think, I think it is genuine and it's been around long enough to forge some sense of Canadian identity. So if that's kind of the openness that you're suggesting, then I can say I kind of feel that too. I observe that as well, but it's not an area of expertise for me. I can't say anything really authoritatively about it, and some of my colleagues in sociology and elsewhere might want something a little bit more definitive from me to that question. I'm just looking at the chat too in case, but I don't see any questions from the chat.
John, I'm not seeing anybody, but I had a question for you, because just something that you brought up in the discussion about sort of who came first as far as Buddhist communities, and I noticed you said Jodo Shin was first in Canada, followed by other traditions, and I know and it's a little bit different for certain countries. Would you say it's primarily a function just of the people who are of Japanese descent that were in Canada that happened to be Jodo Shin, or was it any sort of concerted effort, that sort of thing, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I think a little bit of each. For example, if you look at the Honganjis, the head temples for Jodo Shinshu, you've got Nishi Honganji and Higashi Honganji. Most were Nishi Honganji for places like Canada and the US. Hawaii definitely had both. So Nishi Honganji as an institution, I think, was more proactive in sending people out. But as you touched on, some of that is more responding to demand of people who are there. And one of the things we see with early Japanese immigration patterns in the late 1800s and early 1900s is, for most, the ideal was to go over there, earn a fortune, do well, and come back. And it's especially after some are staying and realize that they're going to stay, and then brides are coming as well, and they're marrying and they're having families, that there is this sort of reaching out to the Hongan, to the head temples, and asking for that kind of support. So then you have, ministers coming to minister to that Japanese and Japanese Canadian community. And you're right. So that depends a bit on, who was immigrating. And if they were mostly coming from rural areas and Jodo Shinshu families, then it's going to be a Jodo Shinshu figure, coming to look after them. It gets a little more mixed up in some ways as time goes on, because when you look at, let's take that San Francisco Zen Center for Soto example, you get figures like Shunryu Suzuki first coming to the Japanese and Japanese American population in the Bay Area, but then being kind of surprised that these different Westerners are dropping in and really want to meditate. They're lay people, but they want to do what the monastics do, but they seem, pretty genuinely interested, and his attentions start to kind of move more to that group, sometimes creating some tensions with the Japanese American group that was first, seeking someone to come out and minister to their needs. So the impetus, the original motivation to go out may have been one thing, and then it might also change a little bit in the American or the Canadian context, depending on what people want and the personality of the individual. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of that depends on who was here, and a little bit of that depends on the institution and how proactive they were for missionizing. Some were definitely more into that than others, and even within a group like Jodo Shinshu, Nishi Honganji was much more engaged than Higashi Honganji, so the Western more than the Eastern.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, because I was always curious why, it was why there wasn't more Zen, in Canada than, but and what you touch on too, it's an interesting point. There's a bit of, and maybe I'm offside a little bit in saying this, a little bit mythologizing about, San Francisco Zen Center, that it was transplanted there out of nowhere, to bring Zen Buddhism to the West, when in fact it was that's not really how it started, as I understand it at all, right?
Yeah. That's not how it started. That's right. And Zen in Japan is so influential when you're looking at culture and art and religion and diplomacy and scholarship and literature and all of these things. But the population base of Zen families was definitely smaller than Jodo Shinshu families. So Zen, had outsized influence relative to its population base. So again, going back to that other part, it's not that surprising that a lot of the people who went to Peru and Brazil and Hawaii and US and Canada were part of that population base where their families were Jodo Shinshu families, even though Zen had that outsized overall influence in Japanese culture.
Oh, thank you very much. We're almost at time. I'm not sure if anybody, any last takers? Going once, going twice.
Might be a call in hand.
Quickly ask if there's 2 minutes. If you've noticed, I know you brought it up in your presentation, and this is, I believe, riffing off of Regan's comments about mythologizing. Do you find that there are any differences in Canada versus the US in terms of their relationship to authenticity, or the need for the real thing in Canadian communities versus American communities in relation to that history? That may be more than a 60-second answer, and I apologize.
It wouldn't have to be if I had a good answer, but I don't know that that's an area where I've seen a really strong distinction. I think if I had to hazard a guess, and it would only be a guess, that broad description that I was suggesting for Canada as a whole, being a little more open to a larger or more diverse kind of diversity, suggests to me there might also be a little bit of overlap with an idea of a kind of multi-perspectival understanding that there's going to be different ways to present something. So maybe not as quickly honing in on a worry of, is this the right one? Is this the real one? Is this the authentic one? But it's going to be gradations of similarity. I think that's sort of my sense of it. And I think it's natural for us to think about, these issues of authenticity, but the more cosmopolitan, the more languages one knows, the more places one's been, I think the more open one is to recognizing the limitations of our own knowledge and our own sense of this is the only way something can be. And conversely, the more narrow someone's worldview has been, the more easily convinced that there's one way to do this and no other way. And even, I mean, Alberta also has its own issues within Canada, but I feel like there's a little difference there between Canada and the US, but it might be a difference that I'm exaggerating a little for effect.
Ryogan, I think you just answered our question about where our direction should go.
Well, we are at time, friends. John, thank you very much for joining us this evening and for your great talk. And thank you everybody for the questions. Just see if you're in Lethbridge, there's well, Kathy's actually in Raymond. So I think you might be the only one from down south here right now. John's teaching a class on Japanese religion at U of L if you happen to be in the neighborhood this fall. So anyway, again, thanks. The book is on Amazon, is that right, John? To try and get some book sales for you.
Track it down there. Absolutely. No, thank you for the invitation as well as that plug. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm just going to stop the recording.